Hello, and welcome to the Dissident Mama podcast. Today, my guest is Padraig Martin. Martin is a devout Christian, author, husband, father, and business owner. He has 2 master's degrees, one in Islamic law and the other an MBA from 2 elite universities. He owns 4 businesses on 2 continents. As a dual citizen, he is both a Southern and Irish nationalist. Padraig is very happily married and father to 7 children. As an author, he writes for Identity Dixie and has published several books under different names, including his latest book, A Walk in the Park, My Charlottesville Story. Currently, he's collaborating with 11 other authors on the creation of a new book that will launch this spring. Thank you so much for being with us, Padraig.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I greatly appreciate it.
So I'll just tell listeners, I feel like I know you. It's weird. I've never met you in person, but I feel like I know you. Been collaborating, with Identity Dixie over the years, and I've interviewed a couple ID guys in the past, and I just think y'all do excellent work over there. So this is going to be fun, kind of getting to know you a little bit better, and there's a lot to talk about. So I do want to start with the ID thing. What do you do at Identity Dixie? What would your title be?
So my title at Identity Dixie would be contributing author.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of confusion regarding Identity Dixie. Identity Dixie is a collective of volunteer writers, content producers.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a group as such. I mean, there are other organizations out there. We're not really organized at all. Our goal was really to produce content that was pro-Southern. And it didn't matter whether you did podcasts, if you did writing, if you did whatever it might be, as long as it was with a pro-Southern bent. And it started out really as a kind of an online group of guys who just, felt the same way about political issues that happen to have certain skill sets. And it grew from there. And it just keeps growing. It's an interesting group to say the least, because it's a group that's not really a group. So I'm not, I know there's a lot of folks in the dissident right that are not fans of shows like Seinfeld and what have you, or it was whatever the name of that show was. But anyway, it's sort of a group that had really no purpose except for one, which was, pro-Southern content. And that's what we've done.
You're talking about the Seinfeld episode where he's like, it's going to be a show about nothing.
Yes, that's right. That's right. This was a group. It was really a group about only one thing in the South, and it's a great thing to talk about. We love the South, but there's really no order. There's no kind of rights. There's no titles. There's nothing there. It's really just a bunch of folks that volunteer their time to ensure that the Southern zeitgeist is shifted to really embrace and explore a pro-Southern vibe.
Yeah. Now, that's why I like ID. There's kind of an umbrella, right? A Southern nationalist, Southern zeitgeist vibe, but there's a lot of varying opinions. And, you learn something from reading the content there and, hear kind of different nuanced perspectives and stuff. I mean, I think it's a great site. Now, when did ID start?
So ID started in 2015.
Okay.
It began as kind of an outgrowth of the TRS group, and it began as TRS Confederates and was a number of individuals. Masonius Rufus, you had Silas Reynolds, a few other individuals as well who were part of the organization that they felt that the Southern argument, so to speak, was being lost in the broader dissident right.
Yep.
And they began converging on certain skill sets to really promote that idea that the South needs its own voice.
Yeah. Now, ID kind of, I don't know, the content went away a few years ago. What happened there? Like Rebel Yell was one of my favorite podcasts, and I was slow coming to Rebel Yell. And so I was like playing catch up, and then all of a sudden, like the Rebel Yells were gone. Can you talk about that? Like what happened to the content?
Sure. So Identity Dixie, the first is the blog itself. There's Identity Dixie, the blog. And that just continues to move. It has it continues to publish no matter what. And then there were additional affiliates, so to speak. And Rebel Yell was a strong affiliate, as such, of the Identity Dixie blog. And it was really a defining contributor to the Identity Dixie brand, as such. And I think what happened over time is that, and you see this happen in occasion. Rufus is an incredibly intelligent man. He's very talented. He's got a great way of capturing the ideas and communicating them. And there were a number of other individuals as well that were contributing to it. You had Mencken, who was part of the group. You had Dark Enlightenment. So you had a few guys that were part of the Rebel Yell brand in its own right. And I think over time, one of it was simply there was a dox. It was a really bad dox that unfortunately occurred. That this really began to affect some of the guys on a more of a personal level. That's my opinion. Doxes are going to happen, unfortunately. And if you're on the dissident right, if you were anywhere to the right of Karl Marx, you're probably going to get doxed.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it affected some of the guys. Rufus really tried hard to kind of hold it together and really worked through a lot of this, a lot of the challenges that occurred in the aftermath, as such. But I think it becomes very hard to run a podcast or a show, especially one like Rebel Yell, which would run roughly about 2 to 3 hours in a given week.
Oh yeah,
it just became a
deep
lot
dives.
of work. Yeah. Oh, as you know, I mean, you have your fantastic podcast. It becomes very hard to do it on your own. So ultimately, I think what occurred was simply that there just wasn't enough volunteers to contribute to the podcast content, and it sort of died. Unfortunately, died on the vine. And I think a lot of the guys are still involved in Southern Nationalist content. We still have all of the guys that were contributors to the podcast still write articles on behalf of Identity Dixie. They still do other things as far as ID is concerned. Some of them contribute to other groups as well in terms of YouTube videos and other kinds of video content. Rufus himself continues to work on other organizations and other work as well. But I think it just became really just too much work. Honestly, it just became one of those things where it just wore him down.
Now, we use the phrase Southern nationalism. So you have nationalism, like sometimes with the capital N, and that can mean something different than a lowercase. Then you have Christian nationalism, civic nationalism. There's all, Black nationalism. We have Southern nationalism. Can you define for listeners what you think that means?
Sure. So first, to begin with, nationalism is, let's break them apart between two different words, Southern and nationalism. I'll tackle nationalism first.
Okay.
Nationalism is really the idea that a given people have a right to exist and to perpetuate their culture, society, and values however they may find necessary. So whether it winds up being Black nationalism is a good example. Black nationalism was largely embraced by the left because it was the perpetuation of a unique racial identity to include its values, its cultures, its traditions, etc. Christian nationalism, again, is the idea of peoples. I mean, nation means people. Its root words come from the term people. And a lot of times what has happened, especially in the post-World War II era, is that nationalism and the state, or national and the state, winds up being somewhat interchanged. And that's not the truth. The state being a geography, a very specific, defined geography, and nation being a people. And so when you have things like national or nationalism, you're really talking about the people at the root. Christian nationalism is the idea that those who identify themselves as Christians will perpetuate the values and traditions and culture that is defined by Christianity. Again, nationalism being the perpetuation of the people's, again, culture, views, traditions. For Southern nationalism is the idea that there is a unique ethnicity within the North American continent, that being the Southern people, who have a right to perpetuate their ideals, their traditions, their values, their cultural norms, their language, etc., food, what have you, and move that forward on their own to contribute on their own to ensure the survivability of that particular identity. Southern, of course, is very unique because, unlike the rest of the United States, the South has a very distinct historical tradition, has a very distinct genetic tradition, actually, in many ways, somewhat due to the fact of isolation in the post-Civil War or war between the states era. So as a result, you have a very unique group within the North American continent that has its own language, its own tradition, its own food, its own culture. And Southern nationalism seeks to promote that, to ensure that it never dies, that it continues forward. Now, within Southern nationalism, there are different sects within it. Some who believe that secession is the only way to ensure that that remains so. And then there are those who believe that there can be a coexistence within this union, these United States, that would be able to ensure that Southern nation, the Southern people, will be able to survive as a distinct culture. So there are distinctions within the group, but Southern nationalism is actually kind of a broad term that really just essentially gets boiled down to the perpetuation of a Southern identity.
Now, I've also read, I think it was your article. It's called Why Broad-Based White Nationalism Fails and How to Fix It. It's from January 2022. It's a really interesting piece. All of your writing is interesting. But this is, it talks about ethnonationalism. Okay, so when you say the South post the war had a distinct genetic tradition, is this what you're talking about, or is ethno-nationalism something else?
No, that is what I'm talking about. So ethno-nationalism, the biggest problem with white nationalism as a broad racial identity is that it fails to take into consideration there are very distinct cultural dynamics that occur amongst the white race more broadly. Russians, for instance, see things very differently than, say, Spaniards or Anglos. So there are very different ethnic groups. You really can't come about with just a broad brush on the white race as such. You really have to take into consideration that each ethnicity has its own traditions, its values, its cultures. If you respect those cultures, if you respect that distinctions, and you work within those distinctions, you may be able to find some symmetries. You may be able to build some alliances. But in reality, at the end of the day, there needs to be an appreciation for the differences of each cultural group within that broader white racial identity. And that's what I'm talking about with regard to ethno-nationalism. The South is its own ethnicity. It has a very strong and distinct identity, again, here on the North American continent, that I think would be hard to argue against. I mean, especially if you look at, say, groups such as the Anglo-Canadians and, say, French Canadians. There are very distinct groups within this North American identity, and one of them happens to be Southern.
Right. And, you know, the term ethnic sometimes freaks people out, but you're talking like from like the ethnos, just meaning a people who share a culture and a tradition. Is that what you mean?
That's right. Yeah. So it's more of a sort of a tribal distinction as such, not one. I think the problem that a lot of folks have is because they've been sort of taught to disown their ethnic identities, their ethnic culture, especially upon arriving into these United States and this supposed melting pot, that ethnic identity or ethnos or ethnic winds up becoming sort of a naughty word. And it really shouldn't be considered a naughty word. It really should be something that we should embrace and value, are the distinctions between different peoples, and appreciate that and celebrate it.
Right. You know, it's truly like a celebration of diversity in not the modern woke way, but it just means that people are different and they have things that are nice about their culture, or possibly, you know, things you don't like about it, but that, you know, it really is the tribalism, the nations that, you know, God created, that we're all different and we can come together within Christianity, which I want to talk about Christianity in a minute, but that we are all different and it's okay. But trying to force people, you know, to like forced integration, that's when things become bad, whether or not you were like people are pro segregation or whatever. I
Right.
always say that forced integration is worse because you're trying to put a square peg, in a round hole kind of thing, and all that does is make people mad, which is why we have the balkanization that we have in America today.
I agree with you. I think I totally agree with you. I think that's the one challenge. So if you consider the arguments of, say, the Antifa as a good example, the Antifa is all about a blending and disowning of ethnic identities. This is not diversity. It's sort of an idea that we can all become one big mass of consumers that would enjoy just drinking the soy drinks and watching the same television programming and movie programming, and somehow embracing these very distinct or different types of, as I guess, a uniform version of morality, etc. And so it's really a divorce from ethnicity, and that's really where, or ethnic identity, and that's really the shame of it all, is that that's really what big corporations want. Wouldn't it make it easier to sell jeans if everybody wore the same jeans?
Mhm.
Wouldn't it be easier to sell sneakers if everybody wore the same sneakers? And that's what the Antifa is. They're really the foot soldiers for global capitalism, for consumerism, and for the destruction of ethnic identity. That's really what they want. Now they can claim that they're warriors for the downtrodden, but they're really not. What they're
Mhm.
trying to do is destroy ethnic distinctions, and in so doing, make it easier, I should say, for the big corporations to sell their wares at a greater profit. And that's the isn't it? It's tragic. I mean, when I've traveled to 78 countries around the world, and when I go to Uganda, if I go to Italy, if I go to France, if I go to Vietnam, I've always been very respectful of the local cultures within which I found myself. I've been respectful of the elders, the tribal elders. I've been respectful of the foods that were served to me, of the eating traditions, of the habits. Even though as a Christian, and Christian identity is very strong to me, I've been respectful of the religious traditions of the individuals with whom I worked in the Middle East, or if I found myself even in the former Soviet Union. To me, it was always a matter of respect and an appreciation for the fact that those people were different from me, that they had their different lives. And I felt it to be tragic that the United States and bigger governments in general were trying to force upon these very traditional societies modernity and systems that simply did not work and were foreign to these tribal identities.
Yeah, and in the article I was referencing earlier, you say, I do not believe pan white unification can work. And that's one of the things, I absolutely think it's okay to be white. I like being white. I like being married to a white man, and I have 3 white children. But that was one of the things about like white nationalism I never understood. It actually seemed too big to me. Like I wanted things smaller. And, there are plenty of, you know, white people who go along with all the woke stuff, or, I don't particularly like Yankees. Well, a lot of them are white too, And then, of
Right.
course, on the flip side, there are people who may be very sympathetic to the Southern position who are not white, who call themselves Southerners, I mean, so this isn't like a kumbaya thing. It's just a pragmatic thing that to me, it seems too big and almost too like kind of centralized to have just something called white. Now, do I think there's a war on whiteness? Of course. But
Mhm.
just because that's the language that's being used, it doesn't mean that we have to use that language either. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not afraid of being white, but that doesn't mean you have to be a white nationalist. Does that make sense?
I totally agree with you. And think about it. I mean, if you were to ask, say, the English and the Irish 30 or 40 years ago, 25 years ago, you had one of the longest sectarian conflicts in human history that occurred between two islands that were separated by, barely a river. I mean, I know the Irish Sea is bigger than that, but it's not by much. And yet you had one of the longest sectarian conflicts. these are very distinct people. They're very distinct even on the same island between the Scots and the English. The idea that they're going to be all of a sudden come this kumbaya moment is ridiculous. The this whole broad-based white nationalist ideal, I will root for anybody. I don't care if they're black or if they're Asian. If they want to maintain their ethnic identity and their tribal distinctions, I am a nationalist at my heart. I'm a separatist at my heart. And so if you want to maintain your tribal identity at the very local level, or whatever level it may be, so be it. Go for it. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to appreciate everything that your tribe does. And it doesn't mean that I want to be part of your tribe or want to fix your tribe or any of that nature.
Or pay for
I'm
your
just
tribe.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You do you, and
You do
we'll do
you.
us. You know what I mean? And that's the thing is, and so for me, if an African in West Africa wants to have his own tribal identity, that's fine. That has nothing to do with me. I'm going to leave you alone. Just don't try to enforce your values upon me, and vice versa. Now, from a European perspective, i.e., white, you're talking about such a broad and distinct group. And why would we want to destroy or dismantle those unique, beautifully unique ethnic distinctions that span across the European continent? There's no reason why we should do that.
Right. Yeah. And then people, I always say this too, as an anti-feminist, I say feminists would have never gotten a foothold if it hadn't been for men letting it happen. The Yankee Empire wouldn't have become so horrifying to everyone around the globe if, there hadn't been so many scalawags that people had bent the knee to it. It's, it's the same thing, kind of, there's a lot of blame to go around. We can look to people that do bad things to us, like the, Antifa and Open Society of George Soros or whatever. But, I think people have to come to they have to have a moment where they understand that keeping going on this path is just not tenable, and we have to do something different. So I guess that was kind of like a wild way to come back and say, what are some of your ideas for nationalism, Southern nationalism, ethno-nationalism that you think could actually happen in the here and now today, and put people aside who are going to pull you down, and say, even people who you think are like allies and some things that are just like, oh, that'll never happen. This is too divisive, that kind of thing. What do you think are some pragmatic ways we can move forward that everybody can kind of have their tribe and we all kind of get along? What would you say to that?
Yes, that's a great question. So I've explored nationalist movements for quite some time. When I studied Islamic law, what I specifically studied was the exportation of Iranian non-state armed groups on behalf of Shia Islam, and how the Shiites were able to survive as a racial minority and racial and religious minority, excuse me, over the course of centuries, that enabled them to now become the most populous state within the Middle East and one of the strongest states in the Middle East, after having a waning effect in the post-Persian era. And what I mean by post-Persian era, I don't mean losing the name of Persia, but I mean losing the empire of Persia. And that's what I did my thesis on. After that, I've studied nationalist groups over time. I found myself at one time working for the United States government in the promotion of groups that really the United States government exploited tribal identities to achieve strategic goals. And I was unfortunately a big part of that throughout the Middle East for a number of years, for the better part of a decade, working with these communities to ensure they received the supplies they needed, support they needed.
Was this in the military?
This was actually after the military, as a defense contractor.
Okay.
I wound up working for the U.S. government for a while after the U.S. military, and then I worked in a contracting capacity for the U.S. government, for the U.S. military. Okay. And I worked with these local tribes, local communities, to ensure that they had the tools and training that they needed to ensure they could succeed in achieving certain local goals that assisted U.S. strategic objectives.
Okay.
And that's one of the reasons why I found myself in literally 78 countries. Now, so I would constantly study these tribes, and I also studied my own history. I grew up in an Irish nationalist household. My family are off the boat from Ireland. At least my mother's side is. My family has a very strong Irish identity, and as a result, what I've studied about that and what I've looked at is what made it possible for these distinct tribes, whether they be the Irish under British subjugation, whether they be the Persian Shiites, surrounded by effectively Turkic hordes of the Sunnah, or if they were different elements, different tribes that existed, like ISIS, the Islamic State, which has been around since the 700s, that somehow survived in a very small, unique community as Kharijites. And what I found was that there was a certain movement with each one of them that continued to perpetuate ideals among a few things. One of them was the cultivation of women. And that is something that I think the dissident right continually fails to do. One of the early understandings of every one of these movements, and even early Christians, by the way, was that children learn their cultural values and mores from their mothers. And then they go on to become adults who are then groomed with, if they're females, are obviously groomed by the elder females within their respective communities. If they were males, they would be groomed by the males within their respective communities. And what I mean by grooming is not like the sexual stuff, the weird stuff that's going on now, but warriors and so forth.
Yeah.
And so you had this tradition in which women were invested very strongly in the perpetuation of the ethnic ideal, the ethnic identity. And they would teach that to their children at a very young age. And then it would grow from there. The young men were taught the histories from their fathers and their grandfathers. And they were taught traditions and values and cultural norms. And they were also invested in wedding women who had similar views, again, mothers and fathers who worked together amongst each other, communities amongst each other, to ensure that these children would eventually marry, they would have children of their own, and that these norms would be perpetuated over time, such until the point at which they had the strength to do so. That's one element that really the dissident right is not thinking about. The problem for the dissident right in general is that it's a very young movement, all things considered, and it is an impatient movement, and it doesn't see that we're in a multi-generational war in which we're really kind of at the early stages of it, unfortunately. Now, some may say that Jesus Christ is coming. May it be so. I'm ready for that. But if that's not going to happen, and we don't know when the Lord's going to return, we need to be prepared to have a multi-generational war. And that has to begin with the children. That has to begin with the cultivation of young mothers and young fathers to see how strong a role family is. Now, from that, if you look at groups like the Irish had no money, they had no banking structure, they had no means to the communications or media, mass media at the time. They had no arms. This is during the 19th century, late 19th century. And yet somehow, within about 20 years of having absolutely no power, they were able to take down the world's most powerful empire. An empire, by the way, that was filled with men who had just come from World War I's terrible front, the trenches, and could have come in and really wiped out the Irish. Well, how did they do that? They did that by cultivating through groups like the Irish Republican Brotherhood, secretive organizations, again, working to ensure that there are parallel societies, parallel communities, and that parallel community structure is critical to the success of any nationalist group. So you have one element that needs to really focus on the family dynamic, the children especially, building up their identity and making sure, reinforcing that they will keep the traditions and values of their culture for generations to come. And there needs to be a second or parallel entity that is growing that provides somewhat of a shadow state as such, that allows for individuals to find, say, whether it's a dispute that happens locally over a bartering system, whether it's bartering itself, a parallel economic system. There needs to be parallel institutions that begin to grow. And that takes discipline, it takes time, it takes work, but you need to be willing to do that. And that is what I think would be successful strategies. Once you get to that point, really the so-called fighting as such, and I don't want to Fed post here or Fed talk here, I guess. I'm sure the federal government already listens to everything here. But that said, the when you get to the fighting stage of the Civil War, if you laid out the groundwork, the hard work, the fighting part is really ancillary. It's sort of it's really toppling over a falling empire as such, or a somebody who is holding you down. They're already weakened at that stage because they no longer have the grasp that they think they have on you. And that's really the key. That's really the important part. That's one of the reasons why, by the way, and I think the left understands this. I think the globalists understand this about the South, is why the South's monuments have been targeted so strongly. They've been targeted because they are emblems of a very unique culture, of a unique culture within the North American framework. And as such, they are the ones that need to be torn down because the South continues to be a stumbling block to globalist identity or globalist ideals, such that you need to begin tearing down those monuments, tearing down those heroes, tearing down that culture. And as they do so, I think ordinary Southerners are seeing what's happening. It's important for us to give them a response, to say, okay, that statue's been torn down. That sucks. That's bad. I'm against that. As have been seen, I've marched against it. But now what do we give the Southerners to remember that that monument may be able to go right back up in 20, 30 years from now? What are we doing to lay the groundwork out to ensure that happens?
Yeah, and I think it was a Gab post you had. You were talking about violence and how violence it will get you nowhere. It's not that you should not be prepared for violence because it can come at you at any time, but that, talking about it online and really, if that's what you're spending your time doing, it's going to go nowhere. It's going to get you, Charlottesville or January 6th, even though those people, most of them there were not seeking violence, but it's just a honeypot, right? But this is what you wrote too within that same Gab post. As the U.S. enters terminal velocity, you should build networks and systems capable of sustaining your tribe. When the rug was pulled out from underneath the Soviet Union, the KGB continued to try and manage as if nothing happened. They did not realize they were suddenly powerless. The Russians who survived and thrived had been building secret parallel societies for decades. This was especially true of Orthodox Christians and atheist USSR. The same will happen here to the FBI. Yeah, and that's, and you end it build, build, build. And to some people, they hear that and they're like, I want to do something now. And I think you use the word impatient and young. Things can be done, but Americans think in terms of hours or days, and, this is why, China is on this ascent, right? They're thinking in terms of like thousands of years, and people have a lot more patience in other part of the world. And they get really upset when the people are dug up, and have to be reinterred or statues come down. I mean, I'm the first one who gets upset about those things, but we have to, pivot the way you just described to me here and in that Gab post, that it's about building, from the ashes, something durable. What else do you think will make Southern nationalism durable?
So again, great question, and I appreciate you laying that out that way. With regard to the Gab post, just to kind of take it a step back, and then I'll bring it to the question you just asked. There's a couple of reasons why I write posts like that. One of them is that we are not ready for a fight. I mean, even if you look at, say, the American Revolution was the byproduct of decades, generations, in fact, of different colonies having internal structures of self-supporting mechanisms to ensure governance existed with or without the crown. That doesn't exist right now. If all of a sudden if let's say, for instance, tomorrow the South found itself free, there would be several governors for sure, states that would have their own legislatures and whatnot that would be in charge, but they would begin competing against each other almost immediately. And there would be a lot of issues that would occur internally within those states that would cause some level of chaos. There
Yeah.
would need to be some kind of symmetry between the population, the civil population, and the governments to ensure that if they find themselves in a free Florida, for instance, that the people that have supported a free Florida for years, decades, and their government are have the same viewpoint, that they identify themselves as distinct individuals within Florida. And that doesn't exist entirely just yet, although that's changing within certain states. So that's the first part of it. So you need to do the work. And the idea is, again, a lot of guys want to go off half-cocked. Another reason why I say stuff like this is I want you to be prepared. There needs to be a preparation for the possibility of violence. God forbid it happens. I don't want that to happen. I'd prefer to see a peaceful separation of states, but you need to be prepared for that. But there are a lot of bad actors out there, especially from the federal government, that try to exploit this anger because we have been brought up in a McDonald's culture where we can go through a drive-through and get our cheeseburger within a couple minutes. There's an idea that you can just go out and get your freedom by pulling a trigger or being that first guy that is the Minuteman that fires the first shot. Yeah, Lexington. These are the kind of ideas that have unfortunately infected American society, and they infect the broader Western society in general, but especially American society. So I want to make sure that young men don't do stupid things and get themselves in a lot of trouble simply because they feel that violence is the only solution. It's not. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some work. Now, as it pertains to Southern nationalism and how to keep it going, we in Florida have begun a project here in Florida that we will be launching again in South Carolina in April, and it has been very successful. The project that we have in Florida is a very loosely defined, not even a group really, and it sort of takes on the Identity Dixie model. We have met as men, fathers and husbands at various locations throughout Florida to ensure that we are becoming more and more involved in local city councils and county councils of various organizations and supporting each other to ensure that those councils and city councils are getting more and more conservative. And when I say conservative, I mean conservative. I don't mean the loosely defined term that unfortunately the Republican Party has co-opted over the last 3 decades or how many decades they've done it. I'm talking about true conservative values. I'm talking about individuals who are willing to push back against the degeneracy that's come into schools. I'm talking about things that have involved with regard to whether or not adult products or bookstores or what have you are being built up in certain areas, locations, or what have you. That kind of thing. We have been working over the last few years, really since 2020, to ensure that we are in every single city council throughout the state. And we've done pretty well, especially north of I-4, which is the kind of cutoff line in and around the Orlando area between Tampa and portions of Daytona Beach. Sort of slices the state kind of in half, as such, the peninsula in half. And we've been very successful in certain counties of being able to get in there and work. And we've gotten success even in Duval County, which is a Jacksonville, which is a large urban area, has a very large Black community. We've been very successful in being able to penetrate those markets. We've been careful, we've been disciplined, and we don't have a name. We call ourselves the Florida Project. We hope that other folks will call themselves South Carolina Project or whatever they call themselves, whatever they want. And it's really individuals who know each other, who meet, who don't come in as a group or an organization, but we work together to identify core issues that are being discussed at those council meetings. And when we discuss them, we talk about the positions, we talk about who the council members are that are supporting them, who is against them, who we need to hold accountable, how we can hold them accountable. And it has become very successful. We've been able to, in Florida at least, been able to get legislators who are on our side. We have a significant number of legislators who are on our side. And we've been able to really change a lot of the political dynamics of Florida in the last really 3 years with some significant assistance from higher members of the Florida government who know what we're doing, understand what we're doing, and ensure that it still remains grassroots, because we really can't fight this battle with globalists
Hmm.
as they fight it. I learned that lesson when I write about this in my book, A Walk in the Park, my Charlottesville story, is that trying to fight these globalists, on their streets, on their terms, is not
Yeah.
going to work. You can't do that. They have every mechanism of power at their disposal. What you need to do is you need to fight quietly. You need to come together as a group that is not seemingly organized. It must look organic. It must be more like a beehive that is now stinging from multiple directions. But there's going to be some level of organization and consistency, and it has to be. You have to have some information that goes out, and so that's what we've done. Fighting the Antifa, fighting the BLM, fighting the mass media, fighting the Democrats, fighting the Republicans, even the organized Republicans on that level does not work. You're not going to be able to go take them on head on.
Yeah.
You got to be small, you've got to be numerous, and you've got to be consistent with your arguments. And now we have more of our female members who have auxiliary units as such, who come in and amplify our messaging, amplifying our voices in different organizational meetings, that has become even more pronounced and has gotten even more things done in places like Orlando, the 15th district of Florida, which would never, areas that you would never have thought would have changed. The Miami-Dade election back in 2022, working with individuals at Hialeah, who were able to understand that this needed to seem grassroots and need to be so small and so minuscule, and yet we do have some significant assistance from the top.
Yeah. I mean, are you taking lessons from the left? Because that's what they've done, right? Over the
Right.
last 100 years.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's how dissidents have always worked. Really, the only time dissidents are successful is when they're too small to hit.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great way. And that's a great way to look at it. And as far as, you're talking about women, are you saying that like some on the dissident right, or, the groypers or whatever, I don't even know if we call them dissident right, but whatever, people who aren't woke, that they have like such a disdain for women that they won't even entertain the idea, where you're saying, I don't know, what are you saying?
Sure. So I think there's a lot of there. One, you're it's,
What are you
yeah.
saying?
I mean,
Sorry.
so I'm a father to 5 daughters. I've
Yeah.
got wife I love.
Right.
I'm kind of sick and tired of the cheap shots
Yeah.
that are given towards women. You gotta. God gave us women as men. God gave us women as our natural partners. So to disrespect them and to kind of toss them out is just pathetic. Come on, guys. You've got to work with the mothers of your children. You've got to work with your wives to make things happen. And there's a certain subtlety to the approach of women that sometimes is missing with men. So there's a complementary effect. I think the problem with a lot of the guys in distant right, and I get it. I mean, there's this whole sort of like softening, and that often happens with when a lot of women organizations or female organizations that occur, that really begins to kind of degenerate into kind of an emotional appeals. But that's not all women. And if a woman's in the distant right, she's not just thinking with her heart, she's thinking with her head as well. And you got to respect that, understand that. And how do you package that? And I think the best way, so a couple of things here. Identity Dixie has never had a female member. And I say member loosely because, again, there really is no membership. It's such a loosely organized group. But when we do get together as Identity Dixie contributors, we don't have females that are part of the Identity Dixie community, largely because there was sort of an early idea that it can create challenges if, let's say, you had a single male member of Identity Dixie
Mhm.
travel with a female, say a married female, or let's say a married
Yeah.
male and a married female, working with these groups, the group dynamics began to fall apart. There's been a lot
Yeah.
of lessons that I've learned about that kind of stuff. So nobody ever wanted to have that kind of stuff kind of creep its way in the system. Let there be an Identity Dixie female version, whatever it may be. that can then work on its own and do its thing. Well, with regard to the Florida Project, that's sort of how we approached that first as well. Was, here we are, fathers and husbands, concerned about the councils, concerned about the groups, and we launched these small groups. Now we've actually got about roughly 50 small groups that work around the state, that meet on occasion at different bars, restaurants, and discuss ideas about what's happening in their respective regions, locations.
Hmm.
What we realized was that you can't do this without the women being invested, without our wives, and many of these wives and many of these mothers are just as deeply invested as we are, and in some cases more so, as it pertains to what's being taught to their kids, what's going on at the councils, what's happening with regard to local laws, sheriffs, etc., holding individuals accountable. So we chose not to have members of the Florida Project. What we chose instead was to have the females work on their own, and that we would coordinate information amongst each other. And again, a lot of that has to do with, we never want to have any kind of situation whereby, say, myself as a married man traveling with another female who is married to somebody else, is traveling to a meeting and there's any kind of even allegation of impropriety at all. We didn't want to have anything that could potentially disrupt the dynamic. So women, they meet on their own. They're growing a little bit faster than we expected.
Nice.
And there are certain organizational skill sets that women bring to the table that men just don't. They don't think about some of the stuff this. A lot of guys like to bring, and I'll be honest, I mean, as a guy, I'm very proud to be a man. I'm not ashamed to be a man, but a lot of us like to bring a sledgehammer to put a thumbtack in a wall. Yet a lot of women are thinking about the thumbtack and the so
The color of the thumbtack.
Yeah, well, exactly. So I mean, but but that isn't that how God made us, right? I mean,
Yeah.
God wants to compliment each other. So God's the one who's like, hey, maybe you shouldn't bring that sledgehammer to the thumbtack. And here I'm thinking, like, why do you worry about the color? So
Yeah.
but it's why we succeed as partners in life in general. And now we're beginning to take that and translating them to political victories.
Yeah, and it's just like any type of nationalism or positivity moving forward. I mean, it can't be so exclusive that if you were to like win the day, you'd get there and be like, well, what was all this for?
Right.
Half the population isn't there, or whatever, or we have chased away all the cool women and we're left with 0 or 5, whatever, people who can't think for themselves or something. Yeah. Again, that's why I like your writing. It's very pragmatic. Hey, Padraig, I got to deal with my dog for 2 seconds. I'm going to pause it. Can you give me like 2 minutes and I'll be right back?
100%.
All right, hold on. Thank you. All right, we are back and my dog is barking in the other room. So all is well. She's not in here with me. So let's dive back into our conversation. I want to get to your books before we wrap up this interview. So let's start with A Walk in the Park, My Charlottesville Story. I have not read it, but I have read the reviews on it and, heard some people talking about it. So I will say that on Amazon, it said it describes my progression from a middle-aged, middle-class father with a well-paying job to a member of the quote unquote dissident right, and how it led me to become a participant of that fateful day. So give us an overview without giving too much away because we want people to buy it. But what's the gist of this book and why should people buy it?
Well, again, I appreciate you asking me. The book itself is really my story arc more than anything else. I spend about maybe a chapter or two on the events of the day. As a former senior officer of League of the South, I was not a senior officer at the time of the march. I kind of earned my way to that position, but it sort of charts my thought arc as such, from one in which I would be considered your typical Republican conservative guy in and around the Obama era, to one who realizes that things aren't right and understands that the attacks on Southern history and Southern culture needed a response. How that response would shape up wasn't exactly the way I ever envisioned, and that's what the book is all about. But then I close with the book with some of the thoughts that I have had over time as it pertains to what occurred, how it occurred, and how it could have been avoided, and how the dissident right can move forward from that day and really take away some of those lessons to achieve some successes.
Would you say one of the themes of the book is the USA ceased at Charlottesville?
Yes, I would. I think that is really the moment. It is part of the theme of it. Is that Charlottesville was I guess it was sort of the final stamp of victory on any kind of freedom of speech or freedom of any personal conscience. That it was the defeat of personal conscience really that occurred at Charlottesville. And the reason wasn't necessarily because the dissident right moved in and protested the removal of a statue.
Mhm.
There were certainly some controversial speakers there. There are speakers that you may or may not want to label as racist or what have you, whatever that even means these days, all that stuff. Really, the bigger failure was the failure of the rest of the establishment to recognize the right of individuals to have a dissenting opinion about a given topic, regardless what that topic may be. In the old days, it used to be that you had individuals could protest, and you may not like what they protested or they were protesting for, but you respected their right to protest and you respected their right to say their piece and go away. Charlottesville was the most prominent, I guess, position, day, I should say, in American history in which every single level of the existing establishment decided to turn its back on the expression of free speech and personal conscience. Every one of them. And then they weaponized bureaucracies to go after the individuals who happened to be either they were the organizers of that day or they were participants in that day to some level. They weaponized every bureaucracy at their power to ensure that they were thoroughly crushed and destroyed. That's never happened in US history before.
Now, this weaponization, were you doxxed after Charlottesville, and were you in the SPLC crosshairs beforehand, or was it all a consequence of that day?
It was a consequence of that day. Charlottesville was the first time I was doxxed by the SPLC, and then thanks to a cousin of mine, in fact, who was far leftist. And then and it was kind of a minor dox, but the dox was bad enough. My problem was that I had a LinkedIn account and I had a fairly high profile job, and it was pretty easy to find me.
Yeah.
I just had this. I never really thought about the consequences. I grew up in an era in the 1980s when you could say your piece, and I didn't have to necessarily agree with you about your piece, but as long as you were not as long as you maintained a professional decorum at work, and as long as you did not act in a way that betrayed or belittled individuals in your professional life, you were fine. You could do whatever you wanted on your weekends or in your personal time. Well, that obviously is not a world within which we live, but of course, I did not realize that in 2017. Unfortunately, my bigger docs, which was like scurrilous attack by the SPLC, largely led by a litigant whom he and I had a major dispute, and a bunch of just stuff that was in there was completely false. And I talked to attorneys about it and was like, well, should I fight this? And they're like, the SPLC has the money to just essentially just crush you. They could say they want. The oddity of that one was the second dox occurred as a result of my next protest, which occurred in January or February, might have been late January, early February 2018, in which I was protesting the federal intrusion into Florida politics. Had nothing to do with any kind of racial issues whatsoever. There was a socialist group that decided to counter a League of the South protest. About 300 armed socialists came at us, mostly students from Florida State University. And I diffused the situation by just repeatedly yelling into the microphone, the federal government is not your friend. And as I continue to do that, I wound up getting into a really bizarre exchange, bullhorn for bullhorn between the socialists and myself, in which all of a sudden some of the socialists began to walk away and began dropping their signs. And largely what I was saying was, for instance, they would say things like, you're Donald Trump fans, you screw Trump or whatever it might be. And I was like, well, we don't really like Trump either. We're League of the South. we're pro Southern. We don't really care about the federal government. And they say, oh, you're pro Israel, you screw Israel, they're evil to Palestinians. We're like, we agree. I mean, we support the right of all Palestinians to have their land back. And so little things like that. And the SPLC then decided to take some kind of, take pictures of me. I remember seeing the photographer who was taking them of me, and then launched this like terribly careless, completely, hit job essentially on me that, took some posts of mine from Facebook and all this other kind of stuff. And I was just like, man, this is pathetic. It's not even well reasoned their attack on me, but it didn't matter. The SPLC did its damage, and it was what it
Right.
was. So, and then ever since then, you got these like weirdos, on Twitter who have nothing else better to do, and I've essentially I just ignore them. I don't really even think about them.
Yeah,
But you do have
that's
these like
good.
weirdos and stuff that are out there that just attack you, and you just kind of get used to it after a while. You're just like, water off the duck's back now.
Yeah, you obviously have had to grow a thick skin, but that's a shame that there was a family member involved in all this mess early on. Were you were fired for your beliefs, or just didn't get a job because of it?
No, I was terminated. So
Okay.
I had a company at the time, and I was terminated as a result of it. I had a really well paying job, and even after I was terminated, I refused to use a sock name and so forth. After the second SPLC hit job, which is really the only reason why I use a sock name at all is because I had a family Verizon family account, number of phone numbers under it, and one of the phone numbers was for my teenage daughter.
Hmm.
And when we were doing the account together, the she liked the number profile from the family. Like they gave us a bunch of numbers, and she liked the numbers that were part of this one number. So she and I decided to switch numbers just on a whim. We're sitting there, signing out stuff. She's like, "Oh, Dad, I like this number." I was like, "Okay, well, you take that number. I'll take this number." Well, it turned out that number that I gave my eldest daughter was considered the family account's like primary phone number or something.
Hmm.
Well, the SPLC called my teenage daughter
Oh my
at high
goodness.
school and asked her, the person from the SPLC called her and asked her, first asked her for me, and said, no, that's my dad. And then they would say, well, how do you feel about your father being a Nazi and
Wow.
hating black people and hating Jews and everything else? And then went in this rant. And then they called her and they asked her, like, what high school you're at? And they called her high school. And they told her high school that I was some kind of racist monster that she needed to be separated from me. This the SPLC reporter did this, and or supposed reporter. And so that was after that, I was infuriated. Of course, my daughter was completely upset,
Oh.
and as a result, that's when I met with some of the guys from the Identity Dixie team and told them what had happened. They said, "Well, yeah, you got to use a sock because even if they know who you are, and even if they decide they're going to come after you, it makes it a little bit harder. It gives at least some degree of separation between who you are and
Yeah.
who they say you are, and that's why I've done it ever since. But because otherwise, up to that point, I didn't care. I sort of was like, I wound up finding a job fairly quickly after that. I sort of was emboldened by like, screw you, I'm not going to back down. But after they effectively attacked my daughter, then I got a call from the school. I got a call. I had to come in. I wound up meeting with a social worker, and they had the sheriffs there as well to meet me and ask if I was abusing my daughter and forcing her to engage in racist activity
Oh my
and all
goodness.
kinds of stuff. And I had a meeting. The principal was there, and I just said, you know what, I'll do this really because my kids and my wife and kids, because
Yeah.
it's clearly these people have they don't there's no boundaries with them.
Yeah, and in Ann Wilson Smith's book, Charlottesville Untold, it talks to a lot of people who were there, and it's not as an insulting way to say this, but people were naive. It's like you were saying, like, this isn't the America we grew up in. We knew like 2017 was a little wild, 2016 was crazy, the Battle of Berkeley and all this kind of stuff. Like, yeah, stuff was getting kind of clown world, but there was still kind of an expectation that the cops are going to do their job and the governor's not going to go insane and whatnot. And it was another Gab post you had wrote where you were just basically saying law and order is dead. Quote, there are zero constitutional protections of free speech, free assembly, or due process in the modern U.S. if you are white. And I agree 100% with that. Would you, and now, I was talking about January 6th earlier, and there were people who, threw you and all the Charlottesville people under the bus, these like normie conservatives that then got Charlottesville in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Then, on one hand, you're kind of like, yeah, I kind of told you so, but, do you ever reach out to people who are like the civic nationalists, like those kind of like America Firsters, and try to build bridges with them? Like, we told you it was going to be Southern, like Southern people were the low hanging fruit. We told you, and it was going to come and bite you eventually. Or is that something you just, I don't know, hope they'll come into their own kind of tribalist fold, or are there bridges to be built there?
So for me, yeah, I do reach out and I do have conversations with civic nationalists. I was one of the folks that would constantly say that we needed to keep those bridges open.
Yeah.
And I understood where they were coming from. I
Mhm.
myself was once a civic nationalist. And I guess when I say I was a normal Republican, I was a conservative Republican, but I kind of looked at things through a civic nationalist lens, excuse me. I never really saw things as the rate. I understood there were racial distinctions and differences, but I wasn't really, I didn't let them transcend the Constitution kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And, over time, obviously things have changed quite a bit. The, as far as the civic nationalists concerned, I think a lot of them are now awakening to certain realities that I don't think they wanted to awaken to. What I try to caution, and I do have quite a few Southern nationalist friends of mine who would like to essentially throw it in their face, haha, we told you so. And I'm like, guys, don't do that. The civic nationalists had a belief, and they're really right now, they're feeling the way many of us felt in 2017
Mm-hmm.
when we believed we had rights. And many of folks who are kind of coming to an awakening in, say, 2014, 2015, 2016, when they began to see this racial divide that really where it was coming from in the sort of Trayvon Martin, Ferguson riots era, Michael Brown, etc. And so I don't want to throw it in their face and say, we told you so. At the same time, I want to make sure that's reinforced that if you are a participant in J6 or if you were a CivNat, welcome to the club. You are now amongst us. You're now
Right.
amongst us so-called Nazis and what have you. So, welcome.
Welcome to the party,
you've
pal.
welcome to the party. Yep. And now it's time to let's set aside our differences and let's work together. And that's actually worked out very well. Again, going back to the Florida project that I've been working with a number of really dedicated Floridians, some of whom were not anywhere near on the Southern nationalist spectrum, certainly were not on any level of sort of white nationalist spectrum or whatsoever, but were civic nationalists who saw what happened in January 6th, and that really awoken them.
Yeah.
Some of the hardest working people in 2022 were in Florida, that is, at least from my personal experience, were individuals that had nothing to do with Southern nationalism, but they were diehard pro-Trump,
Yeah.
J6er types who were like, we need to work harder and we need to have our own government in Florida. And yeah, and so I think, but there needs to be a lot more work done, I think, between the parties.
Yeah. It's like they had their light bulb moment and they don't have to even get all the nuances of like what we get. But
Yeah, right.
there's definitely bridges to be built there for sure. And that goes back to like your point with women. Why would you want to burn a bridge if there's like good women who want to, do some of the heavy lifting too. Um
Agreed.
so let's see. Let's talk about the new book, which does not have a name yet, correct?
It kind of does. I think we're leaning towards one, but yes, we're right. It's still in committee, but yeah, the new book is really exciting. It's a fantastic project.
All right, tell
Really, really
people
happy
what it
with it.
is and how it's going to be
Okay.
the phenomenal, and it's going to have 12 excellent authors and change the world.
Yes. Yes. So yeah. So I mean, so it's 12 authors, sort of a play on "I'll Take My Stand," a book that was written by earlier Southern nationalists from the turn of the century or early 20th century Southern writers, and so it's 12 authors who are some bigger names, including yourself, by the way. Dissident Mom, you'll be, you're contributing to it, Rebecca, and myself, and you got Dr. Michael Hill is contributing a chapter. James Edwards, the political cesspool, he's contributing in chapter, has contributed a chapter. I also have Neil Kumar, a Arkansas candidate, political candidate. So a number of just great names that are coming together and contributing to really what is Ann Wilson Smith, again, also Charlottesville Untold, author of Charlottesville Untold. So it's coming together with regard to really bring, kind of putting into perspective what Southern nationalism is from different angles. It's one of the biggest problems that the Southern nationalist movement has had is that the left has defined what Southern nationalism is.
Yeah.
And that is one of the biggest challenges of any nationalist movement is you need to get out and you need to identify who you are. You
Mm-hmm.
need to define who you are. And with any nationalist identity, because there's so many pieces of the puzzle, it's really important to build a mosaic of an identity.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have an idea of what you want to picture, but that has to be comprised of different components that ultimately form the picture itself. And that's what we're doing with this incredible book. So we have, in many ways, what will it look like it when the South becomes free? How can the Southerners achieve these objectives? We have, with regard to Dixie O'Hara, she wrote her article, her essay is based on Southern food, Southern cuisines, and how they represent both culture, traditions, and the soil that is from the South, and how it kind of feeds into this for sort of family tradition. So you have these various really different architects that are contributing to this mosaic that defines Southern nationalism. And, and it's the first book that I hope will be a series of books eventually, where there is a constant drumbeat of showing Southerners that they are unique, that their ethnicity is unique, and it's worthy of protecting and preserving, and ultimately striving to a free and independent Dixie. And that's really what this book is all about, is here's why you're so special, and here's how to become free, and here's what a free South will look like. It's astounding. Now, April 1st is the date which we would like to have the full launch. It looks like
Wow.
we're on track for that. So April 1st of this year,
Except
we want to do the launch at Dixie Republic in Travelers Rest, South Carolina, and meet together as a group. And anybody who would like to come that day would be fully invited to come and meet the authors that are able to attend, and really just have this big launch to say, hey, we're here and we're not going anywhere,
right.
and this is who we are. So
We ain't scared. So when you say launch, you mean like a printed book in people's hand on April 1st. That could be a thing.
that's right. Yep.
Oh wow.
We'll have the first printed copies. We'll do a soft launch in the middle of March, And that's really more to make sure that the print copy looks good, that anything can be changed, that
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
thing. And then ultimately, when those final edits are done, April 1st is the first official launch of that book. It's Confederate History Month. So we want to
Nice.
that's why we chose April 1st, the
Mhm.
first weekend. On top of that, you have a couple of weekends after that have religious significance due to Easter. But we want to be able to push out this book. April 1st is a big launch. Again, in ready for Confederate History Month, because 2023 is going to be a critical year. I
Yeah.
think 2023 may be one of the most important political years in the history of these United States, and especially the South. And we want to get ahead of that language. We want to make sure we're defining our movement.
Well, it's interesting, we've been talking about secession in various forms for years, not just from the war, obviously, creating our own confederation, our ancestors doing that, but, seceding in your mind, homeschooling's a personal secession, whatever. But now you have, Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about national divorce, everybody's weighing in on this. And what does that mean? Is it secession? Is it coexistence within? Is it some kind of blue state versus red state thing? I mean, it's just fascinating. When I used to say the word secession to like my homeschool mama friends, they'd look at me like, my head was on fire. Now it's like common everyday, language that
Yeah.
people talk about at the, breakfast table or whatever. It's just wild how quickly things move. What do you, I mean, I think the book, I'm looking so forward to reading it because obviously I wrote a chapter. I know what I said, but it's just like I'll Take My Stand or the subsequent Who Owns the South. These are varied perspectives. I mean, again, the umbrella's there that something needs to happen. There needs to be an independence movement, but how that happens, through what channels it occurs, is very, very varied, is what I'm trying to say. Can you give us a feel for, maybe more of the content, a little bit of how varied it is? Or is it really hitting the point, I guess, is my question.
It's varied, but there is a constant theme. So there's three segments of the book, three sections of the book that are really beginning sort of defining themselves as a result of what we've received from the authors that are contributing. The first section essentially defines what is a Southerner.
Okay.
And a few of the authors sort of define that. Again, I go back to the Dixie O'Hara piece. It's a good example of that, where she discusses the confluence of food, ethnic culture, and soul as defining elements of the family tradition within Southern cuisine. And then you have you have that. You have the idea that it kind of breaks into, from there, how to go about making the South free.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where Rick Dirtwater's conversations get into place. How Neil Kumar's goes into place. Now your piece kind of fits into the really the Southern identity component, I should say, more than anything else. So it's different. So you have this one section, sort of what is a Southerner, what is a Southern ethnicity, why is it special? The next section is how do you take that Southern identity and how do you set it free? What are the successful strategies that are capable of really turning it into something that can actually work? Where secession, regardless of how it's defined, because that's something that really is a bigger topic.
Yeah.
How is secession defined? Is it within the, like you said, within the confines of these United States as sort of a breakaway section or sort of semi-autonomous zone, or what have you? And then there's the third section is, what does a free South look like? How does a free South define itself? And Dr. Hill really lays it out in a really articulate way. Again, we're talking about a professor, University of Alabama, a gentleman who has thought about this for the better part of 30 some odd years now. Will be 30 years next year, the 30th anniversary of League of the South, as to what would that look like. And we invited folks in from across the spectrum from Southern Nationalism, because there really are a lot of disparate voices. I mean, there's a lot of voices that keep saying, we prefer to be a free people. We are a unique people. We have unique goals. but there's been very little symmetry between those groups. And
Yeah.
this is another reason why this book was so important. It was in 2023. I believe now is the time for us to come together, setting aside differences, setting aside egos, setting aside any kind of goals or independent goals, what have you, and working together to ensure that when 2024 happens, which I think will be a massive political nightmare, effectively in the United States, the Southern people and Southern nationalism becomes a beacon of light
Mm-hmm.
that draws folks towards it. And that beacon of light needs to be comprised of a few elements, one of which is clearly a unique Southern identity that's well defined, a clear path forward for the South, a South that is free and could show you what it would do if it was free. And then throughout all of this, and more importantly than anything else, is the salvation of Jesus Christ and its importance of the salvation of Jesus Christ as it is expressed within the Southern tradition and Southern ethnic identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like that it is very much a kind of we ain't scared kind of thing, because we had been talking earlier about Boyd Cathy's most recent piece called The Universality of the Southern Cause. And people are always calling me a lost causer and all this kind of thing, and I'd always like push back against that, kind of like, I mean, the cause isn't lost, it's so relevant right now, but I mean, what's the opposite of lost? Is found. I mean, it is not
Right.
It's not lost. Wasn't lost back then. It's never been lost. It's never been more found than today. And I so look forward to the book, because I think people need to have those light bulb moments. And just like Boyd Cathy talked about, it's a universality to fight against tyrants and centralizing powers and people who try to crush your culture and crush the family. This is all part of the Southern cause. This has never been more relevant and more found. And so I'm just really looking forward to reading the book, because I just can't wait to find out all these diverse perspectives. I really hope it's going to do well, not just so you make some money back for all your hard efforts, but I think people are more primed to hear this message now than ever. And that's one thing we can thank progressives for. It's because they push so daggone hard, so fast and so hard that people are ready to hear something different.
Amen. I totally agree with you. And I think, and so by the way, one of the leading titles on the book is An Honorable Cause versus the Lost Cause, or
Ooh, I like
a
that.
lost cause, an honorable cause. And then discussing how that would work into Southern freedom. So I mean, I think really you're spot on, and I totally agree with you. And we obviously agree. I wouldn't be on the show if we didn't. It's the one other challenge I think of the dissident right is it's so angry.
Mm-hmm.
It's so mad, and it's right to be mad. It's right. There's no question we have a right to be angry, but there needs to, Southerners especially need to hear something positive. They need something that says to them, you're special, there is salvation, there is hope. Again, that's through Christ, but there's within your identity itself is a positive future. It's time for us to start painting a positive future. You can't win. You can't just win by being angry at somebody else.
Yeah.
You've got to also win by being positive about your own people.
Yeah. And, there can be political wins, but my take is that there has to be a spiritual, extremely spiritual, not just a part of the foundation. It must be the actual cornerstone, because I think that's what led our ancestors astray, that we were a little schizo and all that. So people will have to read the book to find out more about that. But is there anything else you want to add, Padraig? There's a gazillion other things I could ask you about, but I will have to ask you on April 1st when we meet in person. And I know you have a meeting this evening, but what else do you want listeners to know about?
Really, that's it. First of all, I appreciate the time. I really thank you very much. I'm humbled to be on the show, and I appreciate your contribution to the book. and your contribution to the cause. And I think that any of your listeners who are wondering, how do they contribute? How do they work towards a better future, a broader future for the South? One of the things I want to tell them is, you keep sharing content, keep working on content. If you're not a content producer, share content, get it out there, get the mindset out there, help us expand the Overton window, shift that Overton window, I should say,
Yeah.
to one that goes from this sort of left-right dichotomy, that one that goes from that to one in which the status quo is no longer acceptable, Southern freedom is. And so we need to really begin working on that. And it's a total effort. And really that's it. We don't have the luxury of kicking out folks because people that may have antagonisms here or there, or they may not like women or what stupid stuff like that. We are in this boat together. We need to work together. We need to work harder together, and every little bit helps. We're in a total war for the survival and eventually the thriving of our people. We're going to win this. It's going to take everybody to do it, though.
Yes. Amen to that. Thank you so much for everything you do and for coming on. And I'm sorry we went a little over, but yeah, I hope everybody gets the book, and I want everybody to read Identity Dixie, especially Padraig's work. His writing is phenomenal, and God bless you and your family. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Have a great night, and God bless you and your family as well.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.